I'd love to, but you see, I need marble halls, and I need the seventh veil.
Nobody knew what she meant when she once whispered, "Please don't leave me alone." It wasn't a dramatic line from a film. It wasn't written by a screenwriter. It wasn't meant to echo through theaters. It was real, a quiet confession from a woman the world believed had everything. By the time the world found Marilyn Monroe lifeless in her Los Angeles home in 1962, she had already become more than a star. She was a symbol, blonde, breathless, unforgettable. Her image glowed from billboards, magazine covers, cinema screens. She wasn't just admired. She was consumed. But symbols aren't supposed to break. Icons don't cry in front of photographers. They don't admit fear. They don't confess loneliness. Marilyn did, and almost no one listened. The public saw the diamond dresses, the wine-blown white gown, the playful voice that felt both innocent and dangerous. They saw fantasy, carefully packaged and marketed to perfection. What they didn't see was the cost of maintaining that illusion. A woman who had spent her entire life being renamed, reshaped, repackaged, first by foster homes, then by Hollywood, then by powerful men who claimed to love her but needed her to remain fragile. Her death was ruled a probable suicide, but that conclusion felt too simple. Behind the glamour was abandonment, exploitation, emotional dependency, political whispers that refused to fade. This isn't just the story of a movie star. It's the story of a woman who became the most photographed face on earth and still felt invisible in every room she entered. Before she was Marilyn Monroe, she was Norma Jean Mortensen, born June 1, 1926, in Los Angeles. No flashing lights, no red carpet, no prophecy of greatness. Her father was absent before she could form a memory of him. Her mother, Gladys, struggled with severe mental illness that made stability impossible. By the age of 7, Norma Jean had already learned the sound of suitcases closing. She moved through a series of foster homes like a temporary guest in other people's lives. Stability was something she observed from the outside. Like peering through a window at a family dinner she wasn't invited to join. At 9, she was placed in the Los Angeles Orphans Home Society. Imagine that. The future global symbol of beauty. Unwanted, unclaimed. She later described her childhood as a blur of borrowed beds and conditional affection. Some foster families were gentle. Others were not. There were whispers of abuse, never fully documented, but heavy enough to shape her understanding of love. She learned early that attention could shift without warning. That affection could be withdrawn overnight. By 16, another threat loomed: return to the orphanage or marry. She chose marriage, not out of romance, out of survival. James Doherty, a neighborhood boy, became her husband. Shortly after, he enlisted. Left alone again, Norma Jean took a factory job during World War II, assembling drones for the war effort. That's when a military photographer walked through the factory looking for patriotic images. He saw her. And in that moment, the camera didn't just capture her face. It found its next obsession. And once the world noticed her, it never truly let her belong to herself again. When 20th Century Fox signed her in 1946, the first thing they changed wasn't her talent. It was her identity. Norma Jean didn't fit the fantasy they wanted to sell. So they erased her. Her soft brown curls were bleached into platinum brilliance. Her eyebrows were reshaped. Her hairline was altered through painful electrolysis. And her name, the last link to her childhood, was replaced. Norma Jean became Marilyn Monroe. Studio executives believed audiences didn't want vulnerability. They wanted desire. They wanted escapism. They wanted a woman who could glow under studio lights and distract from post-war anxieties. So they built her carefully. She was coached to lower her voice into a breathy whisper, to walk slower, to tilt her chin at just the right angle, to laugh in a way that felt spontaneous but rehearsed. Every gesture became strategy. Romantic relationships were orchestrated for headlines. Public appearances were calculated. Even her shyness was reframed as seductive mystery. But transformation comes at a cost. The more polished the image became, the further Norma Jean retreated inside. Small roles followed: secretaries, showgirls, charming distractions. Characters written to decorate scenes rather than drive them. And yet, behind the scenes, Marilyn was reading Dostoevsky, studying Chekhov, attending acting classes at the Actors Studio in New York. She wasn't unintelligent. She was underestimated. She wanted respect. Hollywood wanted a poster. And that quiet conflict between the woman craving depth and the industry demanding fantasy would follow her for the rest of her life. Because once the world falls in love with a dream, It rarely allows the dream to wake up. In 1953, everything changed. The film was Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. The moment was carefully staged, a sweeping staircase, a sea of men in black tuxedos, and Marilyn Monroe in a shocking pink satin gown. Singing "Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend." It wasn't just a performance. It was a coronation. That scene crystallized her into something larger than life. She wasn't simply an actress anymore. She became a cultural symbol. Glamour, desire, feminine power wrapped in sparkle. The performance made her untouchable, but it also trapped her. From that point forward, the breathy voice wasn't optional. It was required. The flirtatious innocence wasn't spontaneous. It was contractual. Audiences demanded the fantasy again and again, and studios were more than happy to deliver it. Meanwhile, Marilyn was unraveling. She was often late to set, not because she didn't care, but because she cared too much. Insomnia kept her awake for nights. Anxiety tightened around her chest before every shoot. Sleeping pills became routine, so did stimulants to wake up. Crew members whispered about her fragility. They didn't see the woman trembling in her dressing room, terrified she wouldn't remember her lines, terrified she would disappoint the world. In 1955, she shocked Hollywood by leaving at the height of her fame to study acting seriously in New York. Executives called her ungrateful. She called it survival. She even formed her own production company. A radical, almost defiant move for a woman in the 1950 studio system. Marilyn wasn't just chasing validation. She was fighting for control of her own narrative. And when a carefully manufactured symbol begins demanding autonomy, the system that created her doesn't applaud. It resists. Her marriages followed a pattern that felt almost scripted: intensity, headlines, and then heartbreak. In 1954, when she married baseball icon Joe DiMaggio, America celebrated. It looked like a fairy tale, the nation's sports hero and its most glamorous star. But fairy tales rarely survive real life. Joe admired Marilyn's beauty. He struggled with her visibility. The now legendary subway great scene from the 7 Yearage, her white dress billowing upward as crowds cheered, wasn't just a cinematic moment. It was a fracture. To the public, it was iconic. To Joe, it was humiliation. He wanted privacy, stability, a traditional marriage. The world wanted Marilyn illuminated, adored, exposed to flashbulbs. The tension was unbearable. They divorced after just 9 months. Then came playwright Arthur Miller. Intellectual, introspective, different from the athletes and producers before him. He admired her mind, encouraged her to read, to think. At first, but even that marriage began to crumble under pressure. Fame weighed on them. Expectations suffocated them. Marilyn longed desperately for children. She suffered multiple miscarriages, each one a private devastation hidden behind public smiles. With every loss, her depression deepened. Sleeping pills became constants. So did doubts. By the early 1960s, she was the highest paid actress in Hollywood, yet studios labeled her unreliable. Insurance companies deemed her a risk. It was a cruel paradox. The more revenue she generated, the less secure she became. In Hollywood, profitability doesn't guarantee protection. Sometimes it accelerates disposal. Then came the whispers. At first, they were quiet. Rumors traded in private rooms and late-night phone calls. Her alleged connections to President John F. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy transformed private encounters into national intrigue. In May 1962, she stepped onto the stage at Madison Square Garden to sing "Happy Birthday, Mr. President." The performance lasted barely a minute, but it echoed for decades. Her voice was soft, almost breathless. The crowd roared, the cameras lingered, and the dress, a crystal-covered gown so tight it had to be sewn onto her body, shimmered under the lights like a second skin. It looked effortless. At WASN single quotes D. Behind that moment was turbulence. Unreturned calls, sudden invitations to private gatherings, abrupt silences that left her unsettled. Some believed she had become entangled in something far larger than herself, privy to conversations she wasn't meant to remember. Others argue she was simply seeking affection from powerful men who treated intimacy as disposable. The truth remains blurred. But power hovered around her in those final months, and power is rarely careless. Friends later described her as anxious, increasingly isolated. She kept notes. She confided fears. She oscillated between hope and despair. Was she a political liability or a vulnerable woman drifting through dangerous circles? History hasn't offered certainty, but one truth stands unchanged: when fame intersects with power, the consequences are rarely simple, and power, above all else, protects itself. On August 4, 1962, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her Brentwood home in Los Angeles. She was 36 years old. The official cause: probable suicide due to acute barbiturate poisoning. That word, probable, has echoed for decades, because almost immediately, questions surfaced. Why were certain key figures unreachable that night? Why did phone records suggest calls that were never fully explained? Why did timelines from witnesses shift in subtle but unsettling ways? Her housekeeper reported unusual late-night phone activity. A psychiatrist claimed he had seen her earlier. Friends insisted she had sounded hopeful just days before, discussing future projects and personal plans. The contradictions were small, but they accumulated. Conspiracy theories bloomed almost instantly. Accidental overdose, political cover-up, silencing. Some believed she had become inconvenient. Others argued she was simply exhausted, emotionally, chemically, spiritually. No definitive proof has ever overturned the coroner's ruling, but certainty never fully settled either. Ambiguity became part of her mythology. In death, she transformed. Again, no longer a struggling actress fighting for control, but an eternal image frozen in time. No wrinkles, no decline, no aging. Just Marilyn, forever 36. Perfect, tragic, unresolved. And perhaps that unresolved ending is what keeps the world returning to her story, searching for clarity that history may never provide. After her death, another layer of mystery surfaced. Rumors spread about a small red diary, one she allegedly carried during her final months. According to various accounts, it contained private reflections, names, conversations, fragments of thoughts tied to powerful men and sensitive topics. Some insisted it held political secrets. Others dismissed it as exaggerated gossip. The diary was never officially recovered. No authenticated copy has ever surfaced publicly. Yet its absence only deepened speculation, because Marilyn had begun writing more frequently toward the end of her life, documenting feelings, recording conversations, trying to anchor herself in words when everything else felt unstable. Was the diary real? Or was it another projection layered onto a woman already drowning in mythology? Either way, the narrative shifted. She was no longer seen only as a fragile movie star. She became something more complex, a witness to power. A woman who navigated rooms filled with influence, ambition, and secrecy, and perhaps, in the imagination of many, a casualty of it. Meanwhile, her estate evolved into a global empire. Posters, perfumes, dresses, collectibles, auctions. Her image, once tightly controlled by studios, now generated millions annually. The woman who once struggled financially, who fought for better contracts and independence, became one of the highest-earning deceased celebrities in the world. Irony lingered heavily. In life, she battled to be taken seriously. In death, she became untouchable. And the questions surrounding her only amplified her permanence. Looking back, with modern understanding, many psychologists suggest Marilyn may have struggled with complex trauma rooted in childhood instability. Some speculate borderline personality traits. Others point to chronic abandonment wounds. But in the 1950s and early 1960s, mental health was rarely discussed with nuance. Therapy was stigmatized. Emotional distress was labeled weakness. She was described as difficult, unreliable, temperamental, rarely wounded. Few stopped to ask why she experienced such intense anxiety before filming, why she clung desperately to affection, why rejection, even minor, felt catastrophic. She had grown up without consistent security. Foster homes, uncertainty, conditional love, the patterns followed her into adulthood. When she was late to set, it became proof of irresponsibility. When she forgot lines, it became evidence of incompetence. When she expressed fear, it became drama. The industry capitalized on her breakdowns while overlooking their origins. Sleeping pills were prescribed easily, so were stimulants, emotional. Suffering was medicated, not explored. And when she finally collapsed completely, Hollywood adjusted. Studios restructured contracts. Other actresses filled roles. The machine kept moving. It always does. What it rarely does is protect its most vulnerable stars from the pressure it helps create. Marilyn wasn't just battling fame. She was battling unresolved trauma in an era that didn't have language for it. And without that language, she stood alone in struggles few understood. Marilyn Monroe remains one of the most recognized faces in history. Her image is timeless. The white dress, the red lips, the half smile that suggests both confidence and fragility. But beyond the platinum hair was Norma Jean, the orphan who wanted stability more than spotlight. The actress who longed to be respected for her craft. The woman who once whispered, "Please don't leave me alone." Her story isn't simply about glamour or tragedy. It's about reinvention, repeated, relentless reinvention. She transformed herself from unwanted child to global icon, from factory worker to Hollywood royalty, from dismissed blonde to ambitious producer fighting for creative control. But reinvention comes at a cost. Every transformation required shedding another layer of herself, another compromise, another performance. And somewhere between the camera flashes and the quiet nights alone, the line between Marilyn and Norma Jean blurred beyond recognition. The world fell in love with the image, the industry profited from the fantasy. But the woman behind it, complex, intelligent, vulnerable, struggled to feel seen. Perhaps that's why her story endures, because it forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What happens when a person becomes a product? What happens when desire replaces understanding? Sometimes the brightest symbols cast the darkest shadows. And sometimes the world falls in love with an illusion, while the human being behind it quietly disappears.